the idea of it is we're going to put ewes with single lambs at foot to the hill in 3 different age groups after lambing. So that being 4, 8 and 10 weeks post lambing, that being the lamb age. The ewes will be outfitted with GPS tracking collars so that we can see where they go on the hill, and hopefully we'll find out why they go there. And from there, maybe how that affects the lamb's performance.
Hello, I'm Kieran Lynch and welcome to OviCast, the Teagasc Sheep podcast. Each episode will bring the latest insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. We're joined this week's episode by postgraduate student Michael Dever and Teagasc researcher Dr. Frank Campion to discuss an exciting new project recently launched in collaboration with SRUC that aims to use GPS technology to better understand hill sheep grazing patterns. Frank's going to provide us with a little bit of background to the project, and Michael is going to outline how they will go about assessing animal performance from different groups of sheep that are released onto the hill at various stages. He also explains how the team is going to evaluate botanical composition of the different grazing areas on that hill. Michael explains to us how the GPS collars that are fitted to the ewes will allow the researchers to track their movements and identify specific grazing zones on the hill. We wrap up the episode with Frank sharing his insights on the future direction of the project and the next steps in the research. We start off with him giving a little bit of background to the project.
So yeah, the project just started this year is looking at hill grazing and I suppose the behaviour of hill sheep when they're grazing the hill and how it interacts with the environment they're grazing in. So I suppose, one of the great debates or challenges for hill farmers at times is, putting sheep back to the hill. For some, they have to go back as quickly as they can after lambing because they're limited on green ground. For other farmers, maybe where there's a bit more green ground or better grass growth, there's always a temptation to, we'll hold the ewes and lambs down a bit longer. But I suppose, the question is, if we alter the time we go to the hill, is that going to impact not only the performance of the sheep, but does it also impact where they graze and how they graze? And I suppose very importantly as well, how the sheep interact with their environment. So in terms of the ecological status of the hill, the type of herbicides they're eating, etc. So I suppose this is it's a large question to ask. And I suppose we've looked at some of the data that's come out of other projects like the SUA CIP, and we're making a start at looking at that and some of those questions in more detail. So as part of that, we've recruited Michael Dever. He's a Walsh Scholar working in conjunction with SRUC in Scotland. And, he's the Walsh Scholar now starting this project looking at hill grazing, and we started that on one of our better farms this year.
It's an interesting project, Frank, and it's an area where there's a limited amount of information domestically on. I know SRUC have done some work in this area before, and it's been quite interesting seeing some of their findings. Michael, you have your plate full from the sounds of it. You have a lot of work to get done over the next couple of years. Maybe if you talk to me a little bit about the first part of that project and what you've done with it. So Frank had mentioned earlier, you're starting doing some grazing trials on the hills. Talk to me a little bit about that. What does that actually entail?
Well, thanks, Kieran. The grazing trial, the idea of it is we're going to put ewes with single lambs at foot to the hill in 3 different age groups after lambing. So that being 4, 8 and 10 weeks post lambing, that being the lamb age. These lambs then will be the ewes will be outfitted with GPS tracking collars so that we can see where they go on the hill, and hopefully we'll find out why they go there. And from there, maybe how that affects the lamb's performance.
Okay. And another aspect of this, there's a whole cascade of things from where they're grazing and the botanical composition, how that's impacted. But one of the other key aspects, Michael, obviously will be, performance measures on those ewes and lambs on the hill. So I'm assuming they've been grazed on lowland ground just after lambing, going up the hill. What are the kind of measures you're looking at on them?
So before we let them off to the hill, we're taking the ewe's body condition and her weight, and we're looking at lamb's weight. So we'll have their turnout weight to the hill, and then when we bring them in, we'll get the weight and the body condition again, and we can see is there a change in that. So with the lamb, what sort of live weight gain is it doing, and with the ewe, is she doing better from going up earlier or later, and did she fall off from going to the hill, or did she kind of maintain?
And you have a nice kind of breakdown in the ages to go back, and maybe typically enough of what we see out there from going back at a month old, 8 weeks to 10 weeks of age, where they're well on the way to being off mammy at that stage. So it'll be certainly interesting from that point of view. I suppose, like we mentioned the GPS collars, and this is going to be quite novel for a lot. Could you explain to me from what they look like to how they actually work, Michael?
So the GPS collar, it's a little green box that sits on the kind of the back top of the neck of the ewe on her right. When I'm looking at her, it'll be her right. So the GPS collar It takes a ping from the GPS satellites up in the sky, and that tells you, well, the owl is in this sort of area. And then they send over the same network that your phone works off, that data, that GPS fix gets sent back to the company that makes the collars. They compile the data and it gets put, and then you have a map on your phone or on their website where you can see where the sheep are. I'll get that data. I'll be able to do heat maps and home range maps with it on GIS systems so that we can see then the intensity of the grazing and the areas occupied by the different groups.
Okay, so you're able to track where those sheep have been moving to on an hourly basis.
Yep.
And they're like you mentioned about heat maps and intensity. I suppose maybe just for our listeners, that's where they spend the majority of their time grazing. So they could be walking between two different areas where it pings, but you're going to know where they're spending a lot of time with that heat map idea.
Yes, so just because a sheep has spent time in an area doesn't exactly mean it grazes there, but by having the intensity of the area, you can say with relative confidence or with relative suspicion that yes, she's going to be grazing in this spot and work from there.
Okay, and like I suppose like just for full clarity on it, like all the ewes going up in these different batches are going to have colour, so it's not a case of just one ewe taking a notion and go off. Like you're tracking the movement of each of these different groups going up.
Every O in the group will have a collar going up to the hill, so we can see exactly where each O ends up.
And leave me interested from the point of view of those ewes, where they're spending time at the early part of the season, where they're moving to later on, and is there a difference between the different ages as they go up?
Yeah, so it will be interesting, Kieran, to see where they move. So as Michael said, the collars are going to give us a lot of data on where they move and when they move. So we'll be able to see then, if we go earlier, and we know from being up on hills that there's a lot of hills, there's kind of a mosaic of herbages, different types there. So if we go earlier or later in the year when certain herbages are stronger or weaker, will they move into different areas? And if they do, then will that lead to maybe less under or overgrazing in certain areas because the sheep have started to graze the plants earlier? They've got it under control, maybe for want of a better way of putting it, and they've moved further or moved into a different part of the hill. So that data will all be feeding back then through the grazing data.
And Michael, like we mentioned on performance, I'm assuming you'll be looking at the herbage composition on this hill as well.
We have an initial assessment of the herbage done, or in the process of doing it, and then following on from that, we'll go back on it with the heat maps and see how the sheep's grazing is affecting these sort of areas, how the preference might clip down different areas more than other areas, especially over the course of the year as the feed value of the hill changes, especially as likes of moorgrass gets unpalatable to sheep and heather gets too strong or too tall.
It's an interesting project, and Frank, I might just bring you back in at this point. Like, if you take a couple of different aspects there, obviously there's going to be an impact on botanical composition depending on when sheep go up or where they graze, and making better use out of that hill at time points. There's also then a performance impact that does it cost them being up that bit earlier and getting that overall balance right. So there's a lot of information could come from this project.
Yeah, there is, Kieran, because we know like anything to do with hill grazing, we have to balance everything. We're trying to get a balance of animal performance, but equally, hill sheep grazing plays a very important environmental role. In controlling the I suppose the forages on our hills, but also in the overall ecosystem of those hills. And we see in some areas problems with overgrazing and undergrazing, etc. So I suppose what we're trying to see here is not only how the animal performs, but how it interacts with its area. But equally, as you said, there's a cost associated with that to the farmer. So if we go up early, so as Michael said, there's the ewes up on the hill now, maybe there will be a slightly lower level of performance. But if we're able to compare that to ones going up later, it might balance out in the long run that there's not that much of a difference in performance. And when we look at it in an overall context, lower feeding costs, better management of your hill, in the long term, the actual difference mightn't be that big.
No, certainly, Frank, like there's a lot going to come from this. I suppose that's taken the early phase of production on those lambs up to the point of weaning, really. Longer term, Frank, in terms of animals on that hill and for the rest of the season, what's the plans?
Yeah, so longer term, so I suppose this is the first year of a project. It's a very new project for us in terms of the protocols and the systems. The hope over the next couple of years is that we go into more than just one farm. We do it on a couple of different farms. And then also what we want to start doing is tracking the replacement ewe lambs coming from those ewes. So we want to see, if ewe lambs that went to the hill earlier with their mothers, how did they perform, particularly over that first winter? Where did they go on the hill and how did they graze? So that's the long term plan with that. And like I said, Michael's working closely with with SRUC, with Claire Morgan Davies and Anne McLaren, and so they'll be giving us a good help to it, mining into this data a bit like what they've done with Kirkton over there.
They have a bit of experience in the area. Look, it's certainly an interesting project. Michael, from the sounds of it, you have a busy summer ahead, and I've no doubt we'll be catching up with you at some point towards the end of the year to get an update on how that project is going. But look, it's good to see a bit of new technology being implemented to answer some very basic questions. Gentlemen, good having you both on. Thanks for taking the time to come on with us.
Thanks very much,
Thank you
Kieran.
very much.
We'll leave it there for this week's episode. Certainly we'll catch up with Michael and Frank again to discuss that project at a later date when we have more detail gathered. That's it for me for Updates from our Sheep programme. Keep an eye on our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. I'm Kieran Lynch. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us wherever you get your episodes.